Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us for this Changing the Narrative Forum. It officially concludes our Autism 2020 Virtual Expo. I want to give an acknowledgement to country. I want to pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. My name is Chris. I'm very lucky to be founder and chief enabler at ICANN Network, and I am on Wurundjeri country today. We are very lucky to be having a conversation among friends today. There's some people here who I really admire as advocates and campaigners. Today we have from Southwest Victoria, a corner of Victoria which I love, Wenn Lawson. Wenn, let's be honest, is quite an institution on autism in Australia. Wenn is actually a former board director at ICANN Network, has been an integral part of the ICANN Network family, and has made a mammoth contribution to the writ, the language and the progressive attitudes on autism across Australia and the world. Joining us from Canberra is Yenn Purkis, who's both an author, advocate and a long-time public servant as well. Yenn can speak on a whole range of topics, from autistic pride to employment. Yenn makes an awesome contribution, and there's so many books and resources that Yenn can refer listeners to. So today, throughout the day, there's time for live Q&A at the expo. So we'll make sure that some of Yenn's work is available. And then joining us from San Francisco is Steve Silberman. Steve's written on a wide array of subjects, including autism and neurodiversity, through his award-winning bestseller, Neurotribes. I was very fortunate to meet Steve at the 2016 Victorian Autism Conference by Amaze Victoria, where we were blessed to have a private session with him. I'd like each of us to weigh in on some of the changes we've seen in the narrative around autism in our own lifetimes from our own vantage points. I think it would be great to start with you, Wenn. You've had such an extraordinary story. What changes have you seen in autism, and what's your view on all of that? Weigh in for us.
Totally massive. 30 years ago at a conference, I thought I was possibly the only autistic person there. The whole conference we were referred to as patients, and it was all about our disorder. And I felt I was sitting in there cringing, and I was sure someone would notice, and I'd be told to leave. They were talking about us, but there was no sense of anybody talking to us or with us, and that's been the huge change that over the years, the whole conversation from my perspective, looking back, has been that we're now being consulted, we're being asked, we're being talked to about what's happening for us. And the terms like disorder are very rarely used in our circles. And I believe that autism can become, or an autistic person can develop a disordered way of thinking and have all sorts of issues that they're faced if their needs are not accommodated. Now, I'm not talking about somebody may not have speech. They may not be able to talk and like I can, but they can talk through a light writer or type their messages on a computer, or there are other ways and means to communicate. And none of those things were ever thought relevant in the past, but today folk like Tim Chan, who's one of my heroes, we're beginning to listen and see that humanity is more than ableist, or the ability that we focus on as being normal. What's normal for me is different to what's normal for Steve, what's normal for Yenn, what's normal for Chris, and that whole word has huge implications. So acceptance of self, working with my passions. Wherever I go, I hear people talk about, well, let's focus on this person's interests. Let's navigate school through what's of interest to them. Let's accommodate their passions within the curriculum. Whereas in the past, they would taken those things away so that you could focus on the thing you were supposed to be doing. And that's massive change, massive change. Everywhere I go at conferences around the world before COVID-19, but even during, because of online stuff, there's a very different emphasis. We've got value, and we never had that in the past. I never felt valued. I never felt listened to or heard, certainly not understood. Those things are rapidly changing, from media and television, which sometimes represents autism in sort of extreme ways, but there's still more emphasis on the differences of autistic people, from the good doctor to the Muppet person, it's autistic, to things like Netflix shows with Hannibal, which are a bit scary, but they're all very, very different. And yet autism is being portrayed out there, not just Rain Man, not just those very deficit disordered type. Anyway, I know that I'm probably going on too much, but it is incredibly exciting looking back and seeing how life has changed. The books that autistic people are writing, when I wrote my first book, and I remember talking to a very well-known person in sort of an autism guru in the world, and I was told that I couldn't really be writing that because autistic people don't have insight, and they wouldn't accept this book from me. So that's dramatically changed. You know that loads of autistic people are writing, performing, singing, sharing, blogging, and we're being heard and being listened to. That is dramatic. Yeah. Anyway, I better stop.
Thanks so much, Wenn. Steve, are you happy to weigh in on the changes you've seen in the narrative on autism?
Sure. My first exposure to autism was in 2001, when I wrote an article for Wired magazine called The Geek Syndrome about autism in high-tech communities like Silicon Valley. And back then, autism was considered exceptionally rare. In fact, it was hearing about 2 kids of 2 different technologically adept families in Silicon Valley within a couple of months of each other that seemed like this bizarre coincidence that I needed to check out, you know? And so now we know autism is actually relatively common. It was considered as nothing but a disorder, except on the one little green sprout of a future autistic culture that I saw peeking up through the dreary landscape, which was Laura Tisanchik's Institute for the Study of the Neurologically Typical on the web. It was a satirical site of, sites run by the American Psychiatric Association. And it said stuff like, neurotypicality there is no cure, and so that was the very first glimpse that I had of autistic culture. And what happened over the next few years was that the world sort of became obsessed with autism almost, but unfortunately it was obsessed with the wrong question. And that question was, do vaccines cause autism? And they certainly do not. I actually felt like what was happening was that before Andrew Wakefield did his bogus study, that autistic culture was just starting to emerge. And then that was a huge distraction for so many years, particularly for parents who were exploited by quacks like Wakefield. But I'm extremely happy to say that I just saw a segment on autism on the major American news magazine show. It's the ultimate in sort of mainstream media. It's called 60 Minutes, the show, and they did a segment on autism. And I'd been so traumatized by previous, segments that it actually took me a few days, to get around to watch it. What was amazing was, instead of talking to parents about, the travails of raising their children, instead of talking to doctors about, is it an epidemic, or something like that, the very first people you see on the screen were not just autistic, but autistic people of color in the group as well. And the autistic people in the segment were really driving the segment. And it was about the difficulties that autistic people have in finding employment because of all the barriers to hiring that are in job interviews and all that. And it was really exceptional. And Anderson Cooper, who is as big a star in American news media as you can get, was, to be blunt, saying lines that could have come right out of my book. Like it was amazing. It was a complete transformation. And just to make sure that I wasn't making up all this progress in my mind, I went back and looked back at a few old, segments, and God, they were bloody awful, and I am so happy that now when a major news magazine show wants to talk about autism, the first voices you hear are autistic people, including autistic people of color, which we need more of in the mainstream media representation of autism. But so I actually, even though it's kind of, in a lot of ways, it's a very depressing and frightening time to be alive, particularly in my country here, that made me so happy because it was visible progress that I was allowed to take part in as an ally. And it makes me really happy that that much progress has been made and that we're still making progress now.
Beautifully said. Thanks, Steve. Yenn, please weigh in.
Okay, I'm very happy to weigh in. So I was diagnosed in 1994, and at the time, nobody had heard of what the diagnosis was then, which was Asperger's. No one knew what it was. For several years, no one knew what it was. I also actually have a mental illness, not a misdiagnosed one, but it was misdiagnosed as something other than autism in 1996, mostly because psychiatrists didn't really know what autism was. And they certainly didn't know how it presented in me because they thought that autistic people were all extra studious, just wanting to go to school or, really rules focused. And I was a criminal. So I didn't fit the stereotype at all. So I ended up with a misdiagnosis. But as time went on, more people, so conversations about autism were more common and people had some inclination. So they'd say, my insert relative here has an insert relative here who is autistic. Very little actual knowledge of what that meant, but there was some understanding that it was a thing. And then in recent years, things have really changed and everything's sort of taken off in the past really 5 to 10 years that I've noticed. So instead of people saying, oh, autism, what's that? Or, oh, autism, I have an insert relative here who has it. They've actually got some knowledge about autism to varying degrees. I realised a few things in the advocacy space that really changed in the past few years. So a while back, a certain red-haired Australian politician who I won't mention shot their mouth off about autistic kids. And I thought I need to weigh in on this, but I couldn't because I'm a public servant, so I'm not supposed to get involved in party politics. And I realised I didn't need to weigh in on this because so many other people did. And people across the board were saying, this is not okay, you can't speak about kids like this, it's not cool. And then a couple of years after that, a certain Australian gardening personality came out shooting his mouth off about autism as well. And people in the media were shooting him down in flames, not just autism advocates, but, people with influence in the media saying that's not okay, that this person should behave like that. So for me, those two things demonstrated some of the changes that have happened, that people beyond the autistic community had actually stood up and said, this is not okay to behave like this. You can't talk about autistic people like this. It's not appropriate. It's not suitable. It's not nice. Don't do it. I will say that there is a way to go. So things have definitely changed, but they need to change more. I've got my activist hat on now and I'm saying things need to change more in this space because we're not there yet. We're definitely not there yet. So I think it's really important to keep the momentum going around advocacy. And the other thing is this stuff is all up for grabs. So if we're doing well now, it doesn't mean we'll necessarily do well in the future. We have to keep up the momentum with these things and make sure that we are challenging unhelpful thinking when it comes up and that we are championing the rights of autistic people.
Yeah, Chris, do you mind if I bring up something that I think is one of the most important things that happened in the world of autism this year, but hardly anyone outside of the autistic community even realizes that it has to do with autism, and that is a young man named Darragh McAnulty, who wrote a book called Diary of a Young Naturalist, starting when he was, I think, 14. He started writing. He was doing a nature blog. He wrote a book that when I got a copy of it, you know, people send me books. You know, I get probably a dozen books a week. And, you know, some of them are very heartfelt, but kind of painful to read, to be honest with you. When I started reading Darragh's book, I remember, like, I said, you know, I turned away from my computer. I said, this kid's a bloody genius, you know? And it wasn't like, the thing about it is, it's a very autistic book. It's very much an expression of his passions for nature, for precision in language, for birds, for really precise observations of both the external world and his feelings as well. And so, is it about autism? Yes, but it's mostly about the natural world and the peril that the natural world is in right now with climate change. And yes, Darragh is autistic, but it's not like autistic writer writes autistic book. It's that he used his gifts to write an incredible book, a book that, dare I say, a young Oliver Sacks would have been, you know, proud to write. Do you mind if I read one paragraph of Darragh's writing? Yeah, what the heck? Because I want people to hear just how good this kid is as a writer. In the darkness, my dreams are interrupted. I'm somewhere between swimming to the surface and coming up for air when the flute catches my consciousness. The bedroom walls disappear. The space between my bed and the garden narrows, becomes one. I rise without moving, pinned by the heaviness of sleep. The notes keep falling on my chest. Now I can see the blackbird in my mind. Its testosterone arrows flying as the territorial sonatas spread across the dawn. Engrossed in this symphony, awake and thinking, the whirring of my brain begins. I mean, my God, it's some of the best writing I've read in years. And Darragh was 15 when he did it. And not only that, he got a major UK Literary Prize, the Wainwright Prize, the youngest person ever to win it. And he was shortlisted for the same prize that Neurotribes got, which was then called the Samuel Johnson Prize, now called the Bailey Gifford Prize. So, you know, we've got, like, my book was the first science book to get that prize with a long history. Now we have, you know, a 16-year-old autistic author winning, you know, shortlisted anyway for that prize. And it's not like, you know, my story of autism. It's a story of the world. And I feel like that's the future, is autistic people making contributions that don't have to be just about autism.
And he's got a blog and videos on YouTube, and totally amazing.
He's
So
I think that's quite common, or not common, but happening more these days, that autistic people don't just have to write or present about autism. I mean, I do. I'm exclusively talk and write about autism, but that's because it's my passion. But you look at someone like Hannah Gadsby, who's, you know, she's not famous as an autistic person, she's a famous autistic person, and she talks about it, but it's as part of her message as a comedian. It's not, I'm going to stand up and do a comedy routine all about autism. She's actually a comedian anyway, and the fact that she's autistic is just part of who she is. And I think it's great. I think that people are moving beyond the I'm autistic, so I have to talk about autism, to I have a skill and a passion and things to say, and I'm saying them as an autistic person. But just like being gay, you know, you're not like a gay comedian and all you do is do comedy about being gay. It's actually part of who you are. And what you do, and I think that's a great thing. And I must read that book. It's been on my list. I never have time to read anything, but it is definitely on my list because that sounds wonderful.
It's wonderful.
Really well said, Yeah, I think I completely agree. My brief weigh-in would be, I think, when I set up ICANN 7 years ago, there were lots of things said about me behind my back that I think have really matured. One of them was you have to choose an area of the autism community to focus on. So I'm going to use the crude functioning labels for a second, but I had people say, well, you need to focus on either low functioning or that awful term, low functioning. And I think one of the blessings of being autistic is that your different intuition and creative problem solving, you don't necessarily see boundaries the same way that other more typically developing people do. And so I always challenged it. I said, I don't see why I have to, I see it as a, very diverse but connected community. I don't think I need to focus on one and not the other. And the other blessing I had was I lived with Tim Chan, and he was an incredibly meaningful, important part of my life. So 7 years on from people's kind of questioning and criticism of I needed to choose one, that has greatly matured. We've got autistic young people with greater support requirements, some who are non-speaking, who are in our online group mentoring programs and our school mentoring programs. And yeah, my autistic staff are fantastic mentors of them. We've got parents saying it's their understanding of different communication preferences, interests, anxiety that makes the mentors such powerful role models to the diverse range of young people there. So that has definitely changed. The notion that one area of the autistic community was unable to partner with another, it's moved from us and them to we a lot more, which is good.
Yay.
I'm really relieved to have seen that. The next thing is government policies come a mile. I think, what they say of governments, you lick your finger, feel the wind. Where's the wind going? We'll follow that. That's really what political parties do. And to see, proper disability education plans in Queensland, an autism education strategy, autism state plan in Victoria, and a national autism inquiry in Australia, that's incredible gains. So I think that's very exciting. But like Yenn, I do agree that there is a long way to go. I think if you're, I'm always concerned with schools and teenagers, and there is just such a long way to go to ensuring that every school is a supportive and inclusive environment for autistic kids and teenagers. We have a long way to go. And in some ways, the employment story, there's still so much that can be done there. Especially, I think we have broken the perception that, that autistics are only meant for tech jobs. That was definitely a feeling I had 7 years ago. When I would talk about mentoring, people would say, oh, but in the tech space, it's really working. And I'd say, but I think it can work in a mentoring, facilitation, education space. And people looked at me like, I'm not going to make any comment. I have no idea what you're talking about. But I've got, almost 40 autistic staff now. So I think that's a nice case study to say that's changing. So we're getting there, but there's a long way to go. All right. Well, we've got some time left to think about practical tips we can give others. We have had a lot of parents and autistic young people join us today. I gain an enormous amount of hope from autistic young people. And, when I was in high school, I remember telling a small group of friends, just outside the office, I've just found out I'm autistic, and I told maybe 4 people, and I swore them to secrecy. It was 2002. It was a very different time. Their perceptions of autism, in the media were very different to how I presented. So, I tell everyone I'm autistic now very proudly, but at that time, for where the media was at, I was very quiet and scared. So But today, with such we've had an amazing day with so much hope, and we've got people that want to be part of that positive change. What advice would you give parents and autistic young people who are, in community, wanting to change the views and attitudes of their peers? What advice would you give them? Can we start with Yenn?
Definitely. Thank you, Chris. That's a really important question. I think it's really important for autistic people and parents to be in touch with other autistic people, and to actually, for parents to read blogs and books and content by autistic voices. I think that's really important. And for kids to connect with their community, be that through ICANN or through other means. I think the ICANN network is fantastic and is doing some really good things. I think for a lot of young people on the spectrum, and older people too, we have a number of intersectional sort of elements as well, particularly around gender and gender diversity. I'm non-binary. Myself and Wenn have written a book, shameless book plug, that's due out next March, called the Autistic Trans Guide to Life, which is aimed at adults, but for kids there are also resources out there, and I think it's really important to be aware of those intersectional elements. The ICANN network is always very supportive and respectful around gender diversity in my experience, which is fantastic, and I think more people need to be. Can be quite difficult being trans and autistic. We live in a world that has a lot of ableism, has a lot of transphobia, issues like that. So I think finding your group, finding your peers is really important for autistic people and trans people and autistic and trans people, I suppose. And I think, those connections are really important, because I think people can feel alone. People can feel like it's just them in the world, or it's just their family in the world, and nobody understands, nobody gets it. So finding those voices that do get it is really important and empowering, both for autistic kids and also for parents.
Well said. When, what advice would you give parents and the autistic teenagers who have joined today and contributed so much of their authentic selves?
Yeah, precious truth. And I believe it should be nothing about us without us. As Yenn has said, it's listening to the autistic voice, listening to our kids. I'm a parent, I'm a grandparent of autistic kids and autistic grandkids. And they're all very different, but we need to listen to one another. We need to be open to seeing what that young person or older person might need. Working with the last couple of years with the South Australian government and schools, going into schools and helping teachers understand, not calling it challenging behavior. It's stressed behavior. It's behavior that comes from young people being stressed beyond any kind of understanding, and looking at a young person and saying, you're not trying enough, you're being naughty or difficult. No. Stress and anxiety are the foundation for so much behavior. And if schools at the top, changing school culture so that schools were more accepting of difference and of accommodations that young people need in the classroom, having a mentor, as ICANN is doing, going into schools, working with young people, absolutely showing off, showcasing what young people can do. And that starts with listening to us. It starts with taking that on board, nothing about me without me, sharing that so that it filters through schools, communities, governments, all the agencies, the NDIS, etc. That's the National Insurance for Disability over here, Steve, that has such an input into people's lives. And it's not, I love what Temple is writing. It's, I might need reminding, Chris, because I'm finding words difficult. Not less. What's the other part of that title of
Different, not less?
Different, not less. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wenn. Steve, what advice would you give?
Well, I don't feel quite appropriate giving advice to autistic people, but what advice I would give to parents is have hope, and also autistic teenagers who are struggling. Have hope. One of the big lessons of autism history that I learned by writing my book was that over and over, autistic people would exceed the dire predictions that were made for them by their parents, their teachers, their doctors, etc. And each generation, because there was no sort of transmission of this knowledge really, each generation had to relearn that kids could thrive if their special interests were fed, you know, with more information, if they were given, you know, sensorily non-overwhelming environments. So I would say have hope as for individuals, but also have hope for society. You know, sometimes I'll talk to young autistic people and they'll say like, well, oh my God, there's so much ableism and, you know, I'm bullied every day. And, you know, how is this ever going to change? You know, well, all I can tell you is when I was in high school, which was, you know, half a century ago, when I was in high school, homosexuality was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. I could be put in jail if I'd been caught with a boyfriend, or put in a mental institution. This was how it was. You know, if people appeared on television who were gay, they would have hoods so that they wouldn't be, you know, stigmatized or, you know, I'm married. I'm very happily married now. Things have changed a lot. Hopefully the Supreme Court in America will take that back, but you know, basically there's been a tremendous amount of social progress around homosexuality, and we're at the beginning of a tremendous amount of social progress about autism. So have hope, be uplifted, be courageous, fight. That's the advice that I would give.
Beautifully said. My brief comments here would be, keep your head. Never let other people's fears and misconceptions limit what you're capable of. The journey to accept yourself is a very worthy one, an important one, a valuable one. I find as a 33-year-old, it's still something I'm always working on every day, and it's worth the mental power to keep accepting yourself. I find people sometimes have, I guess, conventionally out there in Australia, a perception of, you know, the timeline of when you should do things or rites of passage of when everything should happen. But embrace your authenticity. Great things are going to come from it. As the closer you embrace your autistic intuition, the more you'll be happy with your work, with your family, with your personal life. Just embrace yourself. There are lots of struggles. But if you surround yourself with people who believe in you and make you feel safe, and don't make you feel judged, and accept you, then those struggles are absolutely overpowered by their belief and what that does for your own self-belief. Well, we might leave it there. We have come to time. We will share some links to the work of Wenn Lawson, Yenn Purkis, and Steve Silberman. Thank you so much for joining us at ICANN Network, changing the narrative on autism as part of our Autism 2020 Virtual Expo. I think this is a nice treat to finish the day, to hear from people with so much insight, experience, and resilience as Steve, Wenn, and Yenn. So thank you for joining us, and we will include links so that you can continue to benefit from their insights.